And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this front elongating east-west here across the Bering Sea as the low center hangs back to the west there. New low develops right here just east of Kodiak Island or the Barrens there. And snow across south central Alaska tonight. Wind weather advisory western Kenai Peninsula into Anchorage for snow and blowing snow. Several inches expected, and that'll spread into Prince William Sound with lighter amounts north into the Susitna Valley and Copper River Basin. Another clear, cold night, especially over the Yukon Flats, again with temperatures lows in the minus 50s. Blizzard warning continues for the eastern Arctic coast tonight. Winds gusting 50 miles an hour and quarter-mile visibilities or less, or just whiteout conditions there. Blizzard warning also out for the Yukon and Kuskokwim Delta areas, but starting to improve over Bristol Bay later tonight toward morning. Next system down here to the south pushes gale force winds, rain and snow in across the Aleutians into the southern Bering Sea, bearing down on the Pribilofs during the day. This front weakens up here, and the winter storm warnings and blizzard warnings end with it, as well as the wind chill advisories with milder temperatures and areas of snow across much of southern Alaska, improving Cook Inlet with snow ending, but continuing Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast into Yakutat, where there's a winter storm warning out for heavy snow, and winter weather advisories portions of the Panhandle for snow. And then for Monday, not too bad here for the southeast coast, especially down to the south. Petersburg down toward Misty Fjords, maybe some sunshine clearing, but a chance of moisture along the coast. Low pressure stays just south of the Kenai Peninsula, chance of snow, Kodiak Island. Another trough here, remnants of the original front, keeps areas of snow over the southwest interior. Next storm pulling up into the Bering Sea with gale force winds associated with it, but lighter winds to the Aleutians with snow and snow showers covering just about all of the Bering Sea northward there to St. Lawrence Island. Dry and still below zero, but warmer though for the interior areas. And for the coastal water forecast, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots with higher gusts here for the south coast. South to southeast 20 to 25 knots on the central coast, and 25 to 35 knots southeast winds on the north coast. Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots. Southeast 15 for Stevens Passage. Southeast winds 10 knots for Clarence Strait. And for Monday, north winds 15 to 20 knots on the south coast. North at 15 on the central coast. And up north, east winds 15 to 20 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots, 4-foot seas. Same thing for Stevens Passage, and light north winds for Clarence Strait from the north at 10 knots. Prince William Sound for Sunday, northeast winds 20 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 30 to 35 knots, north at 30 for the western North Gulf Coast. North winds 20 knots for the Barren Islands, and Kamishak Bay, northeast winds at 25 knots. And small craft advisories, southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 30 knots and 15 knots north of the Forelands. And for Monday, northern Cook Inlet still out of the northeast for the winds at 15 knots, north at 30 knots for southern Cook Inlet, northeast 30 for Kamishak Bay, and southeast at 30 for the Barren Islands. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, east-northeast winds 25 knots, east winds 20 knots for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island, Shelikof Strait, northeast winds at 20 knots, otherwise west winds 25 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, south to southwest winds 20 to 35 knots, and south at 15 for Bristol Bay. For Monday, Bristol Bay, south winds 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, south winds 25 to 35 knots. And Kodiak Island, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Unalaska Island, southeast winds 40 knots. And then for Nikolsky, here, the western island, east winds 35 knots. Adak and Atka, east-southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And 40-knot winds for the western Aleutians. And then for Monday, we've got north to west winds, 30 to 50 knots here for the western Aleutians. Adak and Atka, southwest at 45 knots, and for the eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 45 to 50 knots. And for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, south winds 20 knots, east at 20 for the Yukon Delta coast. Norton Sound, brisk wind advisories for northeast at 30 knots, northeast 25 for St. Lawrence Island. South winds 30 knots for the Pribilofs, and northeast at 20 for St. Matthew Island. St. Matthew Island goes to good gales on Monday, east at 40 knots. Pribilof, south winds 40 knots, seas up to 20 feet or better. And for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southeast winds 25 knots. Brisk wind advisories, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound for east winds at 25 knots. Eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, east-west winds 15 to 25 knots, northeast winds at 10 for the central coast, northeast at 20 on the west side, Chukchi Sea, northeast winds 15 to 25 knots. And for Monday, Chukchi Sea, east-northeast winds 15 to 25 knots, east at 20 knots for the western Arctic coast, central coast, east at 15, and for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds at 15 knots.